The autumn sun was setting over the peaceful suburban streets of Springfield when Special Agent Thompson finished up her last case file for the day. She gathered her belongings, said goodbye to her colleagues at the FBI field office, and headed to her car in the parking garage. The day had been long but productive. She'd made significant progress on a major fraud investigation that had been consuming most of her time for the past few months. As she settled into her silver B&O, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about the warm dinner waiting for her at home. Her mom had promised to drop by with her famous homemade lasagna, and after 14 hours at the office, that was exactly what she needed. The classical music playing softly through her car speakers helped ease the tension in her shoulders as she navigated the early evening traffic. The upscale neighborhood she was driving through was particularly beautiful this time of year. The trees lining the streets were showing their first hints of fall colors, and well-maintained gardens added splashes of color to the elegant homes. She'd driven this route hundreds of times before. It was the quickest way home from the office. That's when she noticed the police cruiser in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't think much of it. As a federal agent, she had a deep respect for her local law enforcement colleagues. But after 3 turns, it became clear the cruiser was following her. She double-checked her speed, verified her turn signals, and mentally retraced her driving. Everything had been by the book, as always. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed to life behind her. Agent Thompson took a deep breath and carefully pulled over to the side of the road, positioning her car perfectly as she'd been trained to do. She turned down her music, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. Through her side mirror, she watched as Officer Adams emerged from his patrol car. His hand was already resting on his holster, an unnecessary precaution that didn't escape her notice. She'd been on both sides of traffic stops during her career, and something about his approach sent up red flags in her mind. His body language was tense, aggressive even, before he'd even reached her window. "License and registration," he barked, not even offering a greeting or explaining why he'd pulled her over. His flashlight beam swept across the car's interior, lingering a bit too long on her professional attire and the briefcase in the passenger seat. "Good evening, officer," Agent Thompson replied calmly, maintaining her professional demeanor. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The officer's response came quick and sharp. "You made an illegal lane change back there, and this vehicle matches a description we're looking for." His tone carried an unmistakable edge of suspicion that seemed to go beyond a simple traffic violation. Agent Thompson knew both claims were false. She hadn't made any illegal lane changes, and her car, a 3-year-old BMW 5 Series, was hardly unique in this neighborhood. More importantly, she knew exactly what was really happening here. She'd seen it before, investigated it before, and now she was experiencing it firsthand. As she prepared to reach for her credentials, she could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. Years of FBI training and experience had taught her to read people, to anticipate their reactions. The way Officer Adams was standing, his aggressive posture, the hand still resting on his weapon, everything told her this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. The cool evening air carried the sound of another police cruiser approaching in the distance. Agent Thompson remained perfectly still, her hands still visible on the steering wheel, knowing the next few moments would be crucial. She was about to turn this officer's biased assumptions upside down, but first, she had to make sure everyone stayed safe. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon make headlines and spark a long-overdue conversation about law enforcement reform. But right now, in this moment, it was just 2 people on a darkening street, each about to learn some very important lessons about assumptions and accountability. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Adams circled around Agent Thompson's B&O, his flashlight beam dancing across the paint job as if searching for imperfections. She could hear him muttering something into his radio, probably calling for backup, a completely unnecessary precaution for a simple traffic stop. Through her mirrors, she watched his every move, her FBI training kicking in as she analyzed his body language. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Adams commanded, his voice carrying that dangerous mix of authority and animosity that she'd heard too many times in her line of work. Agent Thompson took a slow, deep breath. She knew this dance all too well, but usually she was the one investigating these incidents, not living them. "Officer, I want to comply with your request," she said clearly, keeping her voice steady and professional. "I'm going to unlock my door and step out slowly. My hands will be visible at all times." She narrated her actions deliberately, the way she'd advised countless others to do in similar situations. As she emerged from her car, the cool evening air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. A couple of neighbors had come out onto their porches, drawn by the flashing lights and the growing number of police vehicles. Agent Thompson stood perfectly straight, her hands held slightly away from her body, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Officer Adams' partner had arrived now, taking up a position slightly behind him. The new officer's hand was also resting on their holster, creating an unnecessarily threatening atmosphere. In the distance, Agent Thompson could hear yet another siren approaching. "This is a nice car for someone like you," Officer Adams remarked, his tone dripping with insinuation. "Mind telling me what you do for a living?" The question came with a smirk that made its real meaning crystal clear. Agent Thompson felt a familiar knot in her stomach, not fear, but a deep, wearied frustration. She'd spent years building a distinguished career in federal law enforcement, and yet here she was, being treated like a suspect for simply driving home from work. "I'm a federal employee," she replied calmly, knowing that escalating the situation wouldn't help anyone. "My credentials are in my jacket pocket. Would you like me to show them to you?" She kept her tone professional, despite the growing audience of neighbors gathering at a safe distance. "Don't move." Officer Adams barked, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Keep those hands where I can see them." The sudden escalation in his voice drew more attention from the growing crowd of onlookers, several of whom had their phones out now, recording the incident. The third police car arrived, its lights adding to the surreal disco of red and blue that illuminated the peaceful suburban street. A female officer stepped out, assessing the situation with a more measured approach than her colleagues. "Officer," Agent Thompson tried again, her voice remaining steady despite the tension, "I understand your concerns for officer safety. Would you be more comfortable if your female colleague retrieved my credentials? They're in my left inside jacket pocket." The female officer looked to Officer Adams, waiting for his signal. He hesitated, clearly thrown off by Agent Thompson's composed demeanor and professional suggestion. It didn't fit the scenario he'd constructed in his mind. "Officer Chen," he finally said to his female colleague, "check her pocket. Carefully." His tone carried a warning, as if he expected Agent Thompson to suddenly transform into a threat. Officer Chen approached cautiously but respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm going to reach into your left jacket pocket now," she announced, following proper procedure. Agent Thompson remained perfectly still as the officer retrieved her credentials. The FBI badge caught the gleam of the police lights as Officer Chen opened it. There was a moment of absolute silence as she read the credentials, her eyes widening slightly. She turned to Officer Adams, who was still maintaining his aggressive stance. "Sir," Officer Chen said, her voice carrying a note of warning, "you're going to want to see this." The atmosphere was about to shift dramatically, but Agent Thompson kept her position, hands still visible, posture still professional. She'd handled enough cases to know that the next few moments would be crucial, not just for this situation, but for the larger issues it represented. Around them, the crowd of neighbors had grown larger, their phone cameras capturing every moment. The autumn wind carried whispers and murmurs through the gathering, creating an almost theatrical backdrop to the scene unfolding on their quiet suburban street. What had started as a biased traffic stop was about to become something much more significant, a moment that would spark conversations about accountability, prejudice, and the need for change in law enforcement. Officer Adams stared at the FBI credentials in disbelief, his face illuminated by the swirling red and blue lights that had turned the quiet suburban street into an impromptu stage. The badge gleamed in his trembling hands, its weight suddenly feeling much heavier than its actual ounces. His throat went dry as he read the title again, Special Agent in Charge, Civil Rights Division. The growing crowd of neighbors had fallen silent, their phone cameras still recording every moment of the unfolding scene. The only sounds were the idle rumble of police engines and the rustle of autumn leaves dancing across the pavement. Agent Thompson remained perfectly still, her hands visible, her posture professional, a stark contrast to the nervous energy radiating from the officers surrounding her. "I'll need to verify these credentials," Officer Adams announced, trying to maintain some semblance of authority despite his visibly shaken confidence. His voice had lost its earlier aggressive edge, replaced by an unmistakable note of uncertainty. "Of course," Agent Thompson replied calmly. "You can contact the FBI field office directly. The after-hours number is listed on my credentials. I'm sure my supervisor would be happy to confirm my identity." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no hint of triumph, just the steady professionalism that had earned her leadership position. As Officer Chen reached for her radio to make the call, Agent Thompson finally lowered her hands, smoothing her jacket with the practiced ease of someone used to maintaining composure under pressure. The movement caused Officer Adams to flinch slightly, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon again. "Officer," Agent Thompson said softly, but with clear authority, "I think we both know that won't be necessary anymore." Her words carried the weight of years of experience dealing with similar situations, though usually from the other side of the investigation. The radio crackled to life as the FBI field office responded to Officer Chen's call. The voice on the other end was crystal clear in the now silent street. "This is Assistant Director Wilson. Yes, I can confirm that's our special agent in charge you've pulled over. Is there a problem we need to discuss?" The color drained from Officer Adams' face as he realized the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was about to become a major incident that would shine a spotlight on his department's practices. One of the neighbors, an elderly woman in a floral robe, had made her way closer to the scene. "I knew something wasn't right," she called out, her voice carrying across the gathering. "I've seen her drive past here every day for years. Always waves hello, always follows the speed limit. This whole thing is ridiculous." More voices joined in from the crowd, a chorus of support mixing with expressions of outrage. Agent Thompson raised her hand slightly, quieting the growing commotion. She'd handled enough sensitive situations to know that letting emotions escalate wouldn't help achieve the kind of meaningful change this incident could inspire. "Officer Adams," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearby witnesses to hear, "I'd like to discuss why you really pulled me over tonight. Not here, not now, but in an official capacity. Because I think we both know it wasn't about a lane change." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. Officer Adams' partner shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with everyone present. The body cameras on their uniforms continued recording, documenting every moment of this encounter that had gone so differently than they'd expected. "I'll need your badge number and a copy of the dash cam footage," Agent Thompson continued, her tone remaining professional despite the circumstances. "And I'd like the names of all officers present at the scene." She pulled out her phone, noting how none of the officers flinched at her movement now that they knew her identity. A gentle breeze carried the distant sound of more sirens, likely department supervisors responding to what had become a significant situation. The neighbors continued recording, their phones capturing what they knew would become a powerful story about prejudice, power, and the unexpected ways accountability can arrive. Officer Adams finally found his voice again. I was just following protocol," he stammered, but the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. The missing piece of his statement hung unspoken in the air. Which protocol had called for such aggressive treatment of a driver with no actual violations? Agent Thompson looked directly into his eyes, her gaze steady and unflinching. "That's exactly what we need to talk about, officer. Because if this is your protocol, then we have a much bigger problem to address." Her words weren't angry or threatening. They were a promise of the changes this incident would set in motion. The police department supervisors arrived within minutes, their unmarked cars pulling up to the scene with a quiet urgency. The street had become an impromptu town hall, with neighbors standing in their yards and on porches, all witnesses to a moment that would soon spark nationwide conversations about law enforcement practices. The police captain stepped out of his vehicle, quickly assessing the situation. His face showed the careful neutrality of someone who knew they were walking into a potential powder keg. He'd received the radio call about an FBI agent being detained, and the gravity of the situation was written in every line of his expression. "Special Agent," he addressed Agent Thompson directly, pointedly ignoring Officer Adams for the moment. "On behalf of our department, I want to apologize for this misunderstanding." He chose his words carefully, aware of the many phones still recording the interaction. Agent Thompson adjusted her jacket, now free to move normally, though she maintained her professional demeanor. "Captain, while I appreciate the sentiment, I think we both know this wasn't a misunderstanding." Her voice was firm but measured. "This is an opportunity, one that shouldn't be wasted with polite fiction." The gathered crowd murmured in agreement. A young couple who lived next door had brought out their phones' flashlights, illuminating the scene even more clearly for their ongoing recordings. The whole incident was being documented from multiple angles, ensuring that every word and gesture would be preserved. "My team has been investigating patterns of biased policing across several jurisdictions," Agent Thompson continued, her voice carrying just enough for the closest bystanders to hear. "Tonight's incident will now become part of that investigation. I trust your department will cooperate fully." The captain's face tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. We'll provide whatever documentation you need." He turned to Officer Adams, who seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible. "Officer, you'll need to submit your body camera and dash cam footage immediately. No stops at the station first." A tech-savvy neighbor called out from their porch, "Don't worry, we've got plenty of backup footage right here." They waved their phone, drawing a few nervous chuckles from the crowd. The neighbor's comment highlighted how times had changed. Law enforcement accountability now rested not just in official hands, but in the pockets of every citizen with a smartphone. Officer Chen, who had maintained a more professional demeanor throughout the incident, stepped forward. "Agent Thompson, would you like to file a formal complaint right now? I can take your statement." Her offer seemed genuine, a small gesture of integrity in a difficult situation. "The complaint will be part of our larger investigation," Agent Thompson replied, pulling out her phone to make some notes. "But first, I'd like to know how many similar stops have been conducted in this neighborhood over the past year. And I'd like to see the demographic data on those stops." The captain shifted uncomfortably. Everyone present knew what those statistics would reveal. The elderly neighbor who had spoken up earlier nodded knowingly. She'd seen plenty of similar stops from her front window, though few had ended with such a dramatic revelation. A young officer who had arrived with the captain was hurriedly pulling data on his department-issued tablet. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he accessed their database, but his expression suggested the numbers weren't going to paint a flattering picture. "You know," Agent Thompson said, addressing the entire group of officers, "I was heading home to have dinner with my mother tonight. She always worries when I'm late." She paused, letting the human element of the situation sink in. How many other families have had their evenings disrupted by similar stops? How many children have watched their parents being treated like criminals for simply driving through their own neighborhood? Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Several officers looked down at their boots, perhaps thinking about their own families, their own children. The young couple with the flashlights held hands tightly, their free hands still recording everything. The captain cleared his throat. "We'll need to have a department-wide meeting about this tomorrow morning." He looked at Officer Adams. "And you'll be on administrative leave pending a full investigation." "That's a start," Agent Thompson agreed, "but it's only the beginning. This isn't about one officer or one traffic stop. It's about patterns and practices that need to change." She turned to address the gathered neighbors. "Thank you all for being here, for watching, for documenting. Change happens when people pay attention." As if on cue, a news van turned onto the street, its headlights illuminating the scene in a fresh wash of light. Someone had called the local media, understanding that this story needed to be shared beyond their neighborhood. The incident was about to transform from a local event into a catalyst for change. The next morning, the FBI field office was buzzing with activity. Agent Thompson sat at her desk, reviewing the footage from the previous night, not just the official police cameras, but also the videos shared by neighbors on social media. The incident had already gone viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments demanding accountability. She took a sip of her coffee, now cold after hours of examining reports. The data from the police department had arrived early that morning. A year's worth of traffic stops in that neighborhood. The numbers told a story that was both familiar and disturbing. Out of hundreds of stops, the pattern was impossible to ignore. "You're going to want to see this," her analyst called from the adjacent desk, turning his computer screen toward her. Local news stations were running the story on repeat, showing clips from different angles. The headline scrolled across the bottom: FBI agent racially profiled in routine traffic stop, department under investigation. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and even national news networks were all seeking comments. But Agent Thompson was focused on something bigger than media attention. She saw an opportunity for real change. The police captain from last night had already scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. His email suggested he was taking the situation seriously, especially after reviewing Officer Adams' history of complaints that had previously been dismissed or ignored. The department's Internal Affairs Division was suddenly very interested in files they'd let gather dust. "Your mother called," her assistant mentioned, poking her head into the office. "She said she's still waiting on that dinner you promised." Despite the intensity of the situation, Agent Thompson couldn't help but smile. Her mother had already forwarded her 6 different news articles about the incident, along with a reminder that she'd had to put that homemade lasagna in the freezer. The department's statistics painted a clear picture. Over 70% of traffic stops in that upscale neighborhood targeted minority drivers, despite demographics showing they made up less than 15% of the area's residents. Each number represented someone's interrupted evening, someone's dignity being questioned, someone's rights being violated. A knock on her office door drew her attention. The assistant director walked in, looking both concerned and determined. "The chief of police just called," he said, settling into a chair across from her desk. "They're requesting a joint task force to review their departmental practices. Seems like your traffic stop was the wake-up call they needed." Agent Thompson nodded, pulling up more files on her computer. "I've already drafted a proposal for comprehensive reform," she replied, turning her screen to show him the document. "Not just training, but real structural changes. Body cameras with automatic uploads, regular traffic stop analysis, community oversight boards with actual power." The videos from last night continued playing silently on nearby screens. Each angle showed the same story: the unnecessary escalation, the assumptions made, the moment of revelation. But it was the faces of the neighbors that really stood out: their shock, their concern, their determination to document what they were witnessing. A text message buzzed on her phone. It was from the elderly neighbor who had spoken up last night. She'd written a letter to the editor of the local paper, describing years of watching similar incidents from her porch. Finally, the message read, "Someone is listening to what we've been saying all along." The assistant director reviewed her proposal, nodding as he read. "This could be a model for other departments," he noted. "But you know there will be pushback. Change never comes easy, especially institutional change." Agent Thompson stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city below. "That's exactly why this matters," she replied. "Last night wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about all the times this happens when there isn't an FBI agent behind the wheel. All the times when there aren't neighbors recording. All the times when the story doesn't go viral." Her computer chimed with another email: the police department's union representative requesting a meeting. They were probably hoping to get ahead of the story, to shape the narrative before it shaped them. But this wasn't about narratives or public relations. This was about fundamental fairness and constitutional rights. "Schedule everything," she told her assistant. "The union, the community leaders, the department brass. But make sure the first meeting is with that neighborhood watch group. They've been documenting these incidents for years. It's time someone finally heard their stories." As she organized her files for the upcoming meetings, Agent Thompson thought about all the factors that had come together last night: the cameras, the witnesses, her position of authority. But mostly, she thought about how many similar incidents happened every day without any of those advantages. That's what made this opportunity so important. This wasn't just about one night or one traffic stop. This was about changing the system itself. The police department's conference room was packed to capacity 1 week after the incident. Community leaders sat shoulder to shoulder with police officials, while reporters lined the walls. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the number of people crowded into the space, but nobody seemed willing to leave. Agent Thompson stood at the front of the room, presenting the findings from her team's preliminary investigation. Behind her, a screen displayed statistics and graphs that told a story more powerful than any emotional appeal could. Over the past 5 years, she explained, pointing to a particularly telling chart, This department conducted over 15,000 traffic stops in residential areas. The data shows a clear pattern of bias that can't be explained by random chance. Her voice remained professional, but the numbers spoke with outrage all their own. The chief of police, who had replaced his usual uniform with a business suit for this meeting, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The internal affairs investigation had revealed much more than just Officer Adams' misconduct. A whole system of overlooked complaints and buried reports had come to light. But we're not here to just point out problems, Agent Thompson continued, clicking to the next slide. We're here to implement solutions. She outlined a comprehensive reform plan that had been developed with input from community leaders, civil rights experts, and even progressive officers within the department. A young patrol officer raised her hand from the back of the room. What about the officers who've been trying to report these issues for years? Some of us have been filing complaints about biased behavior, but nothing ever happened. Her question sparked murmurs of agreement from several other officers. Agent Thompson nodded, acknowledging the valid concern. That's why our reform plan includes a new independent oversight committee. Half of its members will be community representatives, and half will be law enforcement professionals. But here's the key: none of them will be from this department. Their only agenda will be fairness and accountability. The elderly neighbor who had spoken up during the traffic stop was there too, representing the Neighborhood Watch. She held up a thick folder of handwritten notes detailing similar incidents she'd witnessed over the years. We've been keeping records, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of long-ignored truth. Every stop, every incident, every time someone was treated unfairly in our neighborhood. We just needed someone to finally listen. Officer Adams' empty chair at the meeting spoke volumes. He had resigned the day after the incident, but his departure wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of real change. The department's union representative had initially pushed back against the reforms, but faced with overwhelming evidence and public pressure, they had finally agreed to support the changes. Starting next month, Agent Thompson announced, every officer will wear a body camera that uploads footage automatically. No more missing videos, no more convenient technical difficulties. She clicked to another slide showing the new equipment. But technology is just a tool. The real change has to come from within the department itself. The training program would be completely overhauled. Instead of the usual 4-hour diversity seminar, officers would participate in ongoing community engagement programs. They would attend monthly meetings with neighborhood residents, not as authority figures, but as partners in public safety. A reporter raised her hand. What about Officer Adams? Will he face criminal charges? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Agent Thompson took a thoughtful pause before responding. This isn't about punishing one officer. It's about fixing a system that allowed, even encouraged, this kind of behavior. Officer Adams is cooperating with our investigation, sharing information about unofficial policies and unwritten rules that led to biased policing. The chief stood up, adding his voice to the discussion. We're establishing a new citizen review board with real power, he announced. They'll have access to all complaint records, body camera footage, and stop data. No more rubber stamp approvals or hidden files. The room buzzed with a mix of hope and skepticism. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but the momentum was building. Community members were sharing their stories, officers were speaking up about problems they'd observed, and department leadership was finally acknowledging the need for reform. As the meeting continued, Agent Thompson noticed small groups forming. Officers talking quietly with community leaders, reporters deep in discussion with neighborhood representatives, young cops seeking advice from more experienced officers who had tried to fight the system from within. This was how real change began, not with dramatic confrontations or viral videos, but with people coming together, acknowledging problems, and working toward solutions. The incident that had started with a biased traffic stop was transforming into something much more significant, a blueprint for meaningful reform that other departments could follow. 6 months after the traffic stop that changed everything, Agent Thompson stood in front of a much larger audience. The National Police Chiefs Conference had invited her to share the success story of her department's reforms. The ballroom was filled with law enforcement leaders from across the country, all eager to learn from what had become known as the Springfield model. Real change takes more than just new policies, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. It takes a willingness to listen, to acknowledge problems, and to work together toward solutions. Behind her, slides show the dramatic improvements in community relations and police performance over the past 6 months. The statistics were impressive. Complaints about biased policing had dropped by 60%. Traffic stops now closely matched the demographic makeup of each neighborhood. But more importantly, public trust in the department had risen significantly. The numbers told a story of real progress, not just paper promises. A young boy had approached her before the presentation, tugging gently on her sleeve. "My mom says you're the reason she doesn't worry so much when I ride my bike in our neighborhood anymore," he'd said simply before running back to his mother, one of the community leaders who had helped implement the reforms. Now, standing at the podium, Agent Thompson shared that moment with her audience. "That's what this work is really about," she explained. "Not just policies and procedures, but making sure every member of our community feels safe and respected." The former police captain, now promoted to deputy chief, sat in the front row. He had become one of the strongest advocates for reform, speaking openly about how the incident had forced him to confront his own department's failings. "Sometimes it takes a mirror held up to your face," he often said, "to see what others have been trying to tell you all along." The changes hadn't been easy. Some officers had resigned rather than adapt to the new requirements. Others had initially resisted the increased oversight. But as the positive results became clear, improved community relations, better officer morale, and even more effective law enforcement, the opposition had gradually faded. The elderly neighbor who had spoken up that night had become a regular presence at police community meetings. She turned her years of documentation into a valuable resource, helping identify patterns that needed attention. "I used to watch from my porch and feel helpless," she told a local news reporter. "Now I watch and see things getting better." Agent Thompson clicked to her next slide, showing a group of officers and community members working together at a neighborhood cleanup event. "This is what success looks like," she said, "not just fewer complaints or better statistics, but real partnerships between law enforcement and the communities they serve." The reforms had spread beyond traffic stops. The department had revamped its hiring practices, promotional criteria, and training programs. Every officer now spent time each month in community engagement activities, not as law enforcement, but as neighbors and partners in public safety. Officer Chen, who had shown such professionalism during the original incident, had been promoted to lead the new community relations unit. Her approach to building trust and understanding had become a model for other departments to follow. Even Officer Adams had contributed to the changes, though not in the way he'd expected. His honest testimony about the unofficial practices and unwritten rules that had encouraged biased policing had helped identify systemic problems that needed fixing. He'd found a new career counseling police departments on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. As Agent Thompson concluded her presentation, she shared one final story. "Last week, I drove through that same neighborhood where I was stopped 6 months ago. But this time, when I passed a police car, the officer waved and smiled. It wasn't about knowing who I was, it was about seeing me as a person first, not a profile or a stereotype." The applause that followed wasn't just polite conference clapping, it was the sound of leaders recognizing a path forward. Other cities had already begun implementing similar reforms, using the lessons learned from this incident to create their own positive changes. "The work isn't finished," Agent Thompson reminded her audience as she wrapped up. "It's a continuous process of learning, growing, and improving. But we've shown that real change is possible when we have the courage to face problems honestly and work together to solve them." As she stepped away from the podium, she noticed her mother in the back of the room, beaming with pride. They had finally managed to have that lasagna dinner, and now it had become a weekly tradition, not just for them, but for a rotating group of officers and community members who gathered to share food, stories, and ideas for making their community stronger. The traffic stop that could have been just another sad statistic had instead become a catalyst for positive change. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single moment of truth, followed by the courage to act on it.